Today we will be discussing exchange rates, what they are, the different types we get, and their respective pros and cons. To the thinking chamber. What are exchange rates? It is the price of one currency in terms of another. Think of exchange rates like ratios. $1 equals 20 rand, and 1 rand equals 5 cents. We get three types of exchange rates: floating, fixed, and managed float. Concepts to keep in mind. The value of a currency is determined by its demand and supply. For example, if the demand for a currency went up and its supply stayed the same, its value would increase. For a floating exchange rate, we would call this appreciation. For a fixed exchange rate, we would call this revaluation. If the supply of a currency went up and demand stayed the same, its value would decrease. For a floating exchange rate, we would call this depreciation. For a fixed exchange rate, we would call this devaluation. A floating exchange rate. It is determined by individuals, businesses, and governments. Now, what this means is that the value of the currency is allowed to fluctuate freely without any restrictions from the government. The pros of this is that the government can focus on other objectives. They do not have to allocate resources in order to maintain set value. They can spend that on other projects like education or infrastructure. It can also reduce a current account deficit or increase a current account surplus. For example, if the currency were to appreciate, its exports would increase in value and its imports would decrease in value. This means that total current account deficits would be reduced, or total current account surplus would increase in value. However, the cons of this is that it can discourage trade and investment. Since the currency is allowed to fluctuate freely in value, it makes it more difficult for businesses to plan ahead in terms of how much revenue they will receive when selling a product abroad, or how much they will have to pay for imports. It can also lead to increased inflation. For example, if the currency were to depreciate, its exports would become cheaper, but its imports would become more expensive. And if many businesses rely on those imports in order to function, they would then purchase the more expensive imports, and they are most likely to put that burden on the consumers by increasing their prices, leading to increased inflation. Fixed exchange rate. It is set by the government and maintained by the central bank. What that means is that the government determines the exchange rate early on, and it is then the role of the central bank in order to maintain that. They can either reevaluate the currency by buying it, or they could devaluate it by supplying more of it. Now, the pros of this is that it creates certainty of prices, thus encouraging trade and investment. Since businesses know how much revenue they will receive and what their expenses will be, it allows them to plan ahead for the future with certainty. It allows government to achieve its target rate of inflation. This means that if there was too much demand for the currency, meaning that it would be revaluated, the government, or more in this case, the central bank, would then step in, increasing its supply in order then to devalue it again, in order to ensure that inflation stays the same. Now, the cons of this is that it needs lots of reserves to maintain. In order for the central bank to maintain the set value, it will need to buy lots of foreign currencies, meaning that there's less money to be spent on other objectives like infrastructure or education. Thus, this creates opportunity cost, as money spent on that could have been spent on other things. Now, the third type we get is a mix of both floating and fixed exchange rate. It is a currency whose value is influenced by state intervention. What this means is that the government will allow the currency to fluctuate in value within a certain range, like let's say, for example, 5%. They will allow it to increase or decrease by 5% in value. However, if the currency fluctuates to a value outside of the range, let's say it increases by 6%, then the central bank will intervene, and they will then reduce its value by 1% so that it is back in the set range. Out of the thinking gym. So, what did we learn today? Today we learned what exchange rates are, the different types we get, and their respective pros and cons. We also learned how a government often reacts to this, and how they can influence a currency. Thank you for watching this video. Enjoy your day.